Hi, I'm Dr. Beth Radulski. I hold a PhD in sociology specializing in neurodiversity inclusion, and I am also an autistic person. And today I'm going to be giving you part 2 of my Intro to Neurodiversity course. In part 1 of this series, we talked a little bit about the medical and social models of disability. Now, the social model takes the stance that society contributes to the relatively poor employment, educational, well-being, and quality of life outcomes faced by many neurodivergent people. Today, we're going to unpack that a little bit more and talk about what are these key barriers, where do they come from, and what do we need to be on the lookout for if we want to create a more inclusive society for neurominority groups. We know that social structures, the way that society is organized, can play a significant role in determining quality of life and inclusion outcomes for different groups. For example, we know that patriarchy can create inequality for women. Now, in my thesis, I've argued that there's another social structure called the Neuroarchy. What is that? Well, we have neuro, meaning the neurotypical neurotype, and we have archy, meaning to rule. So the Neuroarchy is the rule of the neurotypical neurotype. What does this look like in a societal context, though? There are 6 key components of this Neuroarchy, and today I'm going to break them down one by one. The first structure is neurotypical culture, and this basically means that culture is unequal for neurodivergent people. So what does this mean? What does this look like? It means that culture is built around neurotypical norms. So the way that we are expected to speak, to act, to socialize, really is built around how neurotypical people would engage in those behaviors. Now, as an autistic person, if I want to engage in a conversation with you, I might not always feel comfortable looking you in the eye. I might use a pretty direct tone of voice rather than speaking with a lot of difference like a neurotypical person might do. So there are some pretty obvious differences in the way that we socialize. But if I don't adopt those neurotypical behaviors, oftentimes I experience difficulty with making friends or with, making connections with colleagues. And the same could be said for many neurodivergent people. The second structure surrounds inequality in employment. Now, we know neurodivergent people have significantly poorer employment outcomes than neurotypical people. In fact, autistic people have the highest rate of unemployment in most Western nations, for example, like Canada. So, acknowledging this, we want to ask, where does that come from? In a lot of places, disabled people can actually be paid below minimum wage. It's legal to hire a disabled person and not pay them what their abled or neurotypical colleague makes. In other cases, there are segregated work programs. So rather than hiring and assuming that society is neurodiverse and therefore we should have neuro-inclusive hiring programs, we might have a segregated pathway into employment and say there are going to be a certain number of positions that are only for neurodivergent people. Oftentimes, these are in fields like technology, mathematics, in a way that only a very particular type of person with very particular skill sets could actually apply for that role and be successful, rather than having diversity throughout different fields. We also see a lot of fear surrounding disclosure in the workplace. So a lot of neurodivergent people report concerns that they could get fired if they disclose that they are neurodivergent, or they might be looked over for promotions or seen as less capable if they are ADHD or dyslexic. Oftentimes, people also report being socially excluded when they do come out in the workplace. Now, the next structure goes pretty hand in hand with inequality in employment, and it's surrounding a system of economic inequality. What's interesting about this system of economic inequality is that it reinforces itself. So if we have an idea that a disabled individual is a burden because they're less productive in the workplace or because they're going to create a need for reasonable adjustment, I don't want to have to provide an employee with a private office. It's going to compromise our team culture if someone's working from home. It could be expensive to have a disabled employee, then they're being excluded. And if they're excluded and unemployed, they're more likely to require a social safety net, which then makes people say, well, that's not fair to the taxpayer. The person who is out there working full time is now supporting someone who's not capable of doing that themselves. And then again, we go back into we're going to seek employment, but we're seen as a burden. That's going to be very difficult. The next structure also goes hand in hand with employment and economic inequality, and that is inequality in law and government. So what does that look like? Well, we talked before about the stereotype of a disabled or neurodivergent person as a burden, and that shows up in our law and in our governing structures. So for example, in many Western countries, autistic people are not eligible to migrate on the basis that they would pose a burden to the taxpayer. In our legal system, if you think about how we conceptualize innocence in a courtroom, so if you're on a jury and you're watching somebody present their testimony and they are rocking back and forth and telling their story and they're not making eye contact with you and they might be using, a different tone of voice to what you're used to, are you likely to think that they're telling the truth? In reality, often we would see those traits as signs of dishonesty. So if we think about neurotypical norms, we talked about neurotypical culture and how we socialize, we think of neurotypical behaviors as honest behaviors. I can make eye contact with you. I'm telling you the truth. I'm looking you in the eye. If I'm sitting still, I'm not fidgeting. That means I'm not anxious. That means I don't have anything to hide. That can manifest in the way we engage with police, which is part of our governing system. That can impact the courtroom, which is part of our governing system. So these are a few examples of what inequality in law and government might look like. The next structure is violence against the community. This is one example of what violence against the community can look like, experiencing much higher rates of physical and sexual violence. 9 in 10 autistic women experience sexual violence. Autistic people are much more likely to experience bullying and physical violence in schooling and workplace and social environments. Another example is the types of therapies that can be used when trying to treat or engage with neurodivergence in a medical setting. Many autistic people in the United States have experienced shock therapy, for example. That's something we tend to think of as quite archaic and outdated, and yet it's something that is still accepted in the context of neurodivergence. Now, our final structure is compulsory neurotypicality, and that is quite the mouthful. So what does that mean? Well, compulsory is kind of another word for mandatory, and we know that neurotypical is someone who's typically developing. So compulsory neurotypicality is just a really complicated way of saying that society makes it mandatory for people to act in neurotypical ways if they want to experience positive outcomes and avoid negative consequences. I'll give you an example. There was a case in Texas a few years ago where a young autistic man was in his own front yard and he was playing with rocks. A passerby walked past him and felt that this behavior looked suspicious and called the police. The police attended the scene and they found this young man, and he wasn't making eye contact, and he was fidgeting, and he was having difficulty following instructions. The police officers assumed that he was on drugs, tased him, beat him, and arrested him in his own front yard for simply lining up rocks. In the workplace, it might mean not disclosing that you're autistic because you are more likely to experience social exclusion if you do. Society creates all of these barriers to inclusion for neurodivergent people that then create an expectation that neurodivergent people, as much as possible, minimize their neurodivergent traits, keep their identity close to the chest, maybe opt out of disclosing in many cases, because that's the best way to avoid consequences. Now, in my next video, I'm going to talk about masking and camouflaging. Hit that subscribe button, make sure you follow along, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch and listen today. For those who are interested, I've linked my PhD thesis in the description below where you can read my research on the Neuroarchy in full. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the comments and I'll be happy to try to answer them for you.